Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history. Someplace where the trumpets have already faded, the armies have marched off, and the crown has just rolled off a severed political career and landed, rather awkwardly, on the floor. Because tonight, we're not talking about kings. We're talking about the people who were left behind when kings fell, their children. The princes who never got to sit on their thrones. The princesses who were suddenly downgraded from "Your Grace" to "Please don't arrest me." The small, confused toddlers who woke up one morning to discover that everyone was whispering now, and no one would explain why the guards suddenly looked different, or angrier. So, if you're ready, maybe dim the lights, settle a little deeper under the blankets, and let's drift through the long, accidental history of royal kids who became political baggage the moment their fathers lost the crown. Because for most royal children, the fall of a king. To talk about after dark. So, let's drift through a few stories, quietly, and meet some of the small humans who had the misfortune of being born into the wrong dynasty at the wrong time. Let's drift first to medieval England, to two boys in a tower. You probably already know the story, though it's usually told with more drama and fewer yawns. But tonight, we're keeping everything soft, slow, and just gently unfortunate. The year is 1483. King Edward IV has died unexpectedly, leaving behind two sons, 12-year-old Edward, the new king, and 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. These boys were more or less the royal equivalent of those bright hotel lobby vases that everyone pretends to love but secretly hopes will not be their responsibility. Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, suddenly decided that he was perhaps inexplicably and mystically destined to rule England himself. This was a very common condition among medieval uncles. Richard placed both boys in the Tower of London, officially for safekeeping, which medieval rulers said the way modern people say, "I might have accidentally deleted something important." The boys were last seen playing in the courtyard. After that, nothing. No escape. No rebellion. No surviving diary entries that say something helpful like, "Please stop putting us in towers." Just silence. The new king, Richard III, insisted everything was fine. Everyone else pretended to believe him. And the princes simply became one of history's quiet unanswered questions. Their fall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly loud. It was just the gentle erasure of two children whose father lost the throne, and took their future with him. Next, let's drift to France. Where royal children suffered from a different problem entirely, they survived, which was inconvenient for everyone. Take the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The French Revolution did not believe in half measures. When they removed a king, they made sure the removal was decisive, permanent, and executed with the kind of bureaucratic enthusiasm that only committees can summon. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had 4 children, though 2 died young. Their surviving son, Louis Charles, was 8 when the revolutionaries decided he was dangerous. Which is a strong word to apply to a child whose main political strategy was crying. After the king and queen were executed, Louis Charles became a problem. Because technically, in the eyes of royalists, he was now King Louis XVII. The revolutionaries solved this awkwardness by, well, locking him in a dark room. Alone. For years. A child. In solitary confinement. He was not allowed fresh air, schooling, or human affection, because affection, apparently, was politically suspicious now. He died at age 10. The official cause was illness, but the unofficial cause was everything. His sister, Marie Therese, was luckier. Instead of being locked in a cell, she was traded, like slightly distressed royal furniture, for political prisoners held by Austria. She spent years trying to figure out who she was allowed to be now. Not a princess. Not a peasant. Just a survivor of a monarchy that had collapsed on top of her. Now, let's drift east, to Russia. Where royal children had a talent for being inconvenient. The Romanovs specialized in dramatic endings, though we'll keep things soft and quiet tonight. Long before the fall of Nicholas II, Russian history had already built up a strong resume of royal child mishandling. Take Ivan VI. A baby who accidentally became Emperor of Russia at 2 months old, which is excessive responsibility even by royal standards. He was immediately overthrown by Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, who politely decided she'd rather rule herself. Rather than harming the baby, which would have been rude, even for 18th century politics, she simply locked him away. But not in a sad Victorian orphan story sort of way. More like an eternally misplaced library book sort of way. Ivan spent his entire life, 23 years, moving from prison to prison. He grew up without toys, tutors, or friends. Whenever guards reported that he was kind, or quiet, or showed signs of intelligence, officials became nervous. Intelligent imprisoned princes were not fashionable. Eventually, he was murdered during a failed rescue attempt. A rescue attempt he didn't even know was happening. A child who became a king before he learned to walk, and a prisoner before he learned to speak. All because the wrong relative put on a crown at the wrong moment. Let's drift further back in time, to the world of the Byzantine Empire. A place where royal children grew up surrounded by marble, mosaics, religious chants, and the constant probability that someone was plotting against them during lunch. Take the case of Michael III's young son. Or the sons of Constantine VI. Or the many boys who had the misfortune of being crowned co-emperor at age 4, because Byzantines thought giving toddlers political titles was somehow stabilizing. These children often found themselves deposed, blinded, or quietly retired to monasteries. Monasteries, in medieval politics, were the equivalent of saying, "We're not killing you, but please never leave this building." Little princes spent their days copying manuscripts, contemplating theology, and trying to forget that they once technically ruled a quarter of the known world. Imagine being 7 and exiled to a monastery for political reasons. Imagine not even understanding the politics. Imagine being told, gently, by a monk, "No, dear, you can't be emperor anymore. Brother Gregory is in charge now." It was a soft ending. A quiet one. But no less final. And now, let's drift to the Mongol Empire. Where royal children dealt with an entirely different problem: they had too many fathers. Not biologically. Politically. When a Khan died, succession involved uncles, brothers, cousins, and ambitious steppe aristocrats who all believed, quite sincerely, that they were uniquely qualified to rule the largest land empire on earth. The sons of defeated Khans usually faced 3 fates. Absorption into another branch of the family, which was basically like being adopted by the people who had just conquered your parents. Political hostage status, which meant living in a tent so luxurious that you sometimes forgot you were, technically, imprisoned. Vanishing into the steppe, which is a poetic way of saying, "We're not sure what happened, but it probably wasn't great." Royal children in the Mongol world were rarely killed outright. They were too valuable. Too symbolic. Too dynasty-shaped. But their lives were often defined by who controlled them. Your father fell. Your uncle now raised you. Another uncle wanted you dead. A third uncle might adopt you. A fourth uncle wanted to marry you into his line, if you happened to be a daughter. A fifth uncle might offer you a pony. It was complicated. But quietly complicated. Let's drift west again, this time to Scotland. Where small royal children developed a survival strategy called, grow up in another country. James I of Scotland, captured as a boy, imprisoned by the English for 18 years. James II, king at age 6, controlled by noble factions for most of his childhood. James III, also became king as a child. James V, king at age 1. Scottish princes had a life cycle something like: born. Crown placed on head before they could speak. Noble regents start arguing. Child becomes a symbol. someone inevitably sends them abroad for safety. They return years later, confused but polite. Children of fallen Scottish kings sometimes survived surprisingly well, mostly because everyone was too busy fighting each other to harm them directly. Chaos is dangerous, but it is also, occasionally, protective. And now, let's drift to the softest of all fates, exile. Many children of overthrown kings simply became wanderers. Not peasants. Not nobles. Not quite royalty. Just people carrying a royal surname that made border guards nervous. The children of the deposed Portuguese Braganzas. The Spanish Bourbons after Napoleon. The children of African kings displaced by colonial powers. Indian princely heirs shipped to England for education. Persian princes sent to Paris. Ottoman princes exiled to France, where they discovered cafes, cigarettes, and the strange modern feeling of being irrelevant. Life in exile could be almost normal. Almost. But every passport, every letter, every polite conversation carried the quiet reminder that somewhere out there was a throne that used to be theirs and now belonged to someone else. No armies were chasing them. No towers were waiting. No prisons. Just a long, slow life spent not being what they were born to be. A soft ending. A tired one. But perhaps the kindest of all. So what happened to the children of fallen kings? Well, everything. And nothing. They were hidden. Protected. Imprisoned. Exiled. Married off. Forgotten. Or turned, accidentally, into symbols of rebellions they never asked for. Some grew up to be kings after all. Some became monks. Some became rumors. Some became history's long echo of what might have been. Most were just children, small, frightened, confused, trying to survive the political collapse of the adults around them. They didn't fall with their fathers. But they lived in the rubble. And in the quiet. Always the quiet. Part 2, What happened to the children of fallen kings? Hey everyone. Let's settle back in, maybe adjust your pillow, maybe let your breathing slow a little. Because tonight, we're still wandering through the quieter corners of royal history, the places where lost crowns echo softly, and where the children left behind had to figure out what it meant to grow up in a world that no longer had space for them. In the first part, we drifted through towers, monasteries, exiles, and a few more prisons than anyone really needs before bedtime. But we're not done yet. Because the fall of a king didn't just reshape the lives of his children during childhood. It followed them into adulthood too, shaping who they married, where they lived, what they were allowed to say, and, occasionally, whether they were allowed to say anything ever again. So let's keep drifting. Softly. Quietly. Through the long shadow cast by a fallen crown. Let's move back for a moment to a kingdom that always seemed to fall apart at exactly the wrong time, England. We tend to imagine English princes growing up in warm, well-lit palaces, surrounded by knights and tutors who said things like, "Your Highness, perhaps don't poke the tapestry with that dagger." But for the children of fallen kings, the castle walls weren't comforting. They were warning labels. Take Henry VI, the chronically unlucky king who lost his throne twice and spent the rest of his life proving that mental illness and medieval politics were a disastrous combination. His only son, Prince Edward of Westminster, was raised like a child who was already a political slogan. People whispered that the Queen ruled in his name. People whispered that he wasn't even Henry's biological child. People whispered a lot, medieval people loved whispering, and none of it helped a young boy who just wanted to throw a javelin and be left alone. Prince Edward grew up in exile. France, Scotland, back to France, then back to England. His father's crown came off like a loose button, and every time it fell, Edward's life tilted a little more. By age 17, he wasn't just a prince, he was a symbol of a civil war. And symbols rarely get happy endings. He died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Some say he fell in combat. Some say he was executed afterward. Some say he annoyed the wrong nobleman. The accounts vary, which usually means the truth wasn't flattering. Prince Edward never sat on the throne. He barely sat still. His whole life was spent moving, a wandering heir following a wandering crown. Let's drift a little south, to the sunlit courts of Spain. Spain produced some of the most tragic royal children in Europe, not because they were violently deposed, but because they were delicately undermined. Take the children of Queen Joanna, better known, somewhat rudely, as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Now, Joanna probably wasn't mad. She was more likely depressed, isolated, manipulated, or all three. But medieval men had a very specific way of describing women who didn't do what they wanted. Ah yes, she must be insane. When Joanna's husband died, the charming, unfaithful, politically gifted Philip the Handsome, her mental health collapsed. Naturally, the men of the family saw this as a political opportunity. Her children were quietly taken from her. One by one. Her oldest son, Charles, was raised to rule an empire. Her daughters were sent to convents or political marriages. Joanna herself was locked away in a monastery for nearly 50 years, not because she was dangerous, but because her existence was politically inconvenient. And her children? Well, they grew up with power, yes. But also with the knowledge that their rise had required their mother's disappearance. Fallen kings were one thing. A fallen queen was another. And her children lived in the shadow of a decision that none of them had been old enough to understand. Now let's float east again, to the glittering but brittle world of
chimneys, the medieval game changer. Now, at some point, humanity decided that maybe, just maybe, all the smoke in the living room was a problem. That's when the chimney entered the chat. Chimneys began appearing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, first in monasteries and wealthy homes. It was a total revolution in heating. Instead of one smoky hearth in the middle of a room, you could now have multiple fireplaces on different floors, each with a flue that carried smoke neatly out of the building. The downside? Chimneys were expensive to build, tricky to maintain, and had an unfortunate habit of catching fire. Still, they were a huge step up from, let's just make a bonfire indoors and hope for the best. Castles like Dover and Kenilworth in England eventually got elaborate chimney systems, with fireplaces big enough to roast an ox, which, coincidentally, was sometimes exactly what they were used for. The warming pan and other medieval inventions. Even with fireplaces, bedrooms could still feel like meat lockers. That's where a few clever little tools came in. One was the warming pan, a small metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals and slid between the bed sheets before sleeping. Think of it as a 14th century electric blanket, minus the electricity, and plus a small risk of setting your mattress on fire. Then there were foot warmers, little boxes with embers placed under your feet while you sat, and bed socks, though they didn't call them that, of course. They just wore layers until movement became optional. For the wealthy, fur-lined robes and heavy cloaks were essential indoor fashion. You didn't wear your house wore you.
some warriors, some traders. Some simply lived quiet lives in the same towns their fathers once ruled. A fallen king's child here didn't always lose status. Sometimes, they gained a new one untouched by the responsibilities or expectations of ruling. It was one of the few places where a royal child might look at their father's downfall and think, well, this might actually be an improvement. Now let's drift into the world of the Holy Roman Empire, a place so politically chaotic that even historians sometimes need a nap afterward. Here, kings fell often, mostly because there were too many people who thought they were kings. When an emperor was deposed, his children were rarely imprisoned. They were reclassified. A royal son might become a duke, a margrave, a prince bishop, or, in particularly bureaucratic cases, a count of something recently invented. Royal daughters were married off to neighboring states as quickly as humanly possible, usually to secure the family's next political gamble. The children of fallen emperors didn't disappear. They just slid sideways into different political boxes. Sometimes they rose again. Sometimes they didn't. But they rarely died for their father's crown. They just adjusted their titles. Medieval Europe loved titles. It had more titles than common sense. Next, let's wander up to Scandinavia, where monarchies rose and fell the way snowdrifts shift in the wind, quietly, slowly, and with minimal paperwork. Children of fallen kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were often fostered by noble families, raised in comfortable obscurity until someone decided whether they were a problem or not. Many lived perfectly normal lives. Or as normal as one can live when one's name still opens castle doors. Some became knights. Some clerics. Some even became merchants, which medieval nobles considered slightly embarrassing but not fatal. But occasionally, one child would return. Like a quiet ghost. Like a rumor with better posture. But occasionally, one child would return. Like a quiet ghost. Like a rumor with better posture. Claiming a throne. Reviving an old claim. Starting a gentle, well-mannered civil war. Scandinavian civil wars were famously polite. Many ended with treaties that basically said, let's just share the crown and take turns. This created some very confused children of very confused fallen kings. But confusion, at least, was not fatal. Now let's drift back into France, because France always has one more tragic royal child waiting in the wings. This time, it's the children of Napoleon. Now, Napoleon did not technically fall. He more slid down the political staircase, loudly, twice. His son, Napoleon II, was taken to Austria and raised by a grandfather who preferred him safely hidden behind curtains. He grew up in luxury. But never learned French properly. Never saw a battlefield. Never ruled anything larger than his own schedule. He died at 21, consumed by tuberculosis, and by the weight of a name too large for one boy to carry. His father had ruled Europe. He ruled his bedroom. This was one of the softest, saddest forms of political erasure, the kind that replaces power not with prisons, but with polite suffocation. And finally, let's drift to the quietest fate of all, the children who simply chose to disappear. Some royal children, after losing everything, walked away. They changed their names. They became scholars, merchants, priests, poets, people who bought bread without anyone bowing. Some lived longer than any of the kings who replaced their fathers. Some lived happier. Some lived anonymously. Some lived freely for the first time. A fallen king's child did not always fall. Sometimes they landed somewhere softer. Somewhere human. So what happened to the children of fallen kings? Everything. And also, nothing unusual. They were protected, imprisoned, adopted, tucked away, lost, found, married off, forgotten, or quietly transformed into someone entirely different. Most didn't want power. Most didn't understand it. Most were simply born at the wrong moment in the wrong palace. They survived their father's downfalls, not with swords, not with diplomacy, but with smallness. With silence. With patience. Because children do not fall with kings. They only live in the shadows left behind. And those shadows stretch very, very far. Hey everyone. Let's settle back in, loosen the shoulders, maybe take that slow breath you meant to take 10 minutes ago. Because tonight, we're wandering into the softer, dustier corners of royal history again, the places where the portraits stop, the records fade, and the children of fallen kings continue to quietly exist, long after the crown has slipped off someone's head and hit the floor with a very undramatic thud. No need to hurry. We'll just drift. From one hidden room to another. From one displaced child to the next. And, as usual, we'll keep the tone gentle, even if the royals involved made decisions that were anything but. Let's drift to France, and into a tower with two very unfortunate boys. The story of fallen kings in France has a particular flavor to it. A flavor best described as a mix of wine, paranoia, and a complete inability to handle political transitions without locking someone up. So, let's settle into the quiet tragedy of the princes in the tower's French equivalent, the story of Charles Orleans' son, a small, quiet boy named Louis of Orleans, who had the misfortune of being born into a dynasty that loved power but hated stability. Louis's father, Charles, had been one of France's most important dukes, until he was assassinated in a narrow Parisian street by the men of the rival Burgundy faction. It was a classic medieval move. Very political. Very personal. Very messy. Louis was just a toddler at the time. Which meant he inherited exactly three things. A title. A set of enemies. And anxieties he was too young to understand but almost certainly felt anyway. When his father fell, Louis became a political problem, which, in royal life, is never good for childhood development. He didn't get a comforting nursery or a wise tutor. He got confinement. A quiet one. But still confinement. His closest relatives protected him in big stone houses with thick walls and very few windows, a medieval way of saying, please don't kill this child. We're trying to keep him alive long enough for him to learn how to sign documents. Louis grew up under constant guard. He wasn't allowed to mingle with other noble children, because mingling tends to lead to alliances, and alliances tend to lead to rebellions, and France had enough rebellions to last several lifetimes. He spent years reading, pacing, and being politely bored. A lifestyle he perfected to the point that, once free, he became one of medieval Europe's most introverted poets. Which makes sense. If your childhood is essentially a politely lit prison, poetry becomes a natural escape. But Louis was one of the lucky ones. He survived childhood. He grew up. He eventually left his fortress of safety and walked into adulthood like a hesitant deer stepping out of the woods, deeply suspicious of sunlight. And then, he rebuilt his family. Quietly. But fully. A rare, soft ending. Now let's float over to Russia. Where fallen kings created children no one wanted to claim. Russia, in the days of dynasties and tsars, had a very specific approach to handling the children of disgraced rulers, pretend they didn't exist, but also keep them under watch, just in case they ruined everything by existing too loudly. One such child was Ivan VI, a forgotten czar who became a baby emperor, then an imprisoned toddler, then a political inconvenience, and then a tragic footnote. But tonight isn't about Ivan. It's about his siblings. The ones history usually forgets, because they were neither crowned nor killed, they just lived in that strange middle space of too dangerous to free, too harmless to execute. When Ivan VI's regency collapsed and Empress Elizabeth seized the throne, because Russians never did anything calmly, she ordered the entire family arrested. The children, all under 10, were packed into wagons and taken deep into the countryside. Not dramatically. Not violently. Just quietly. The way unwanted letters are slipped into a drawer. They lived in a series of small houses, accompanied by guards who were instructed to make their lives dull, controlled, and uneventful, an order they followed with exceptional enthusiasm. For years, the siblings weren't allowed visitors, weren't taught politics, weren't allowed books without approval, weren't permitted to write letters. The goal was simple, let them grow up, but let them grow up away from everything. They became adults with no political ambitions because they had no political vocabulary. They couldn't rebel, they barely understood what rebellion meant. They didn't even know how their brother had once been czar. That detail had been removed from their lives the way a teacher erases the last line on a chalkboard. Eventually, they were quietly released. Not into power. Just into obscurity. A gift, in its own understated way. Their story is soft, but heavy, like a blanket that's been sitting in a cupboard too long. Let's drift west, to Scotland, where a queen's children grew up without her. Now we float to Scotland. A land of fog, stone, and monarchs with more dramatic arcs than a modern TV show, but we'll keep it slow. This is the gentle tragedy of Mary, Queen of Scots' children. Mary's fall was famously turbulent. But the fate of her only surviving child, James, is less dramatic and more, quietly ironic. When Mary was imprisoned and forced to abdicate, baby James became king. Not that he noticed. He was 1 year old and mainly concerned with basic survival and whatever medieval toys were available, which, given Scotland's budget at the time, were probably carved sticks. The Scottish lords, not trusting Mary or each other, whisked James away to Stirling Castle. They raised him with strict tutors, cold rooms, and a Scottish fear of disorder, which he absorbed like a sponge. James grew into a nervous, bookish young man. He adored learning. He also adored not being murdered, which became his lifelong hobby. His mother remained imprisoned, first in Scotland, then in England. James grew up seeing her name mostly in letters, reports, and occasionally whispered warnings. The emotional distance became physical distance. And the physical became permanent. James became King of England. Mary died without ever seeing him again. It's the kind of tragic relationship that could fuel an entire season of a prestige drama. But we'll keep it soft here. Just a mother and child who lived parallel lives, drifting further apart with every passing year. A gentle wandering into the lives of the forgotten sons of the Islamic empires. Most Islamic empires had well-organized systems. But none were particularly kind to the spare sons of fallen rulers. Take the Abbasid princes after the Mongol sack of Baghdad. When the city fell in 1258, many members of the royal family vanished, some killed, some escaped, and some quietly reappeared years later in the courts of other Muslim rulers, looking very much like people who had just watched their entire world collapse. One such child was Abu el-Qasim Ahmad, a young prince who managed to survive by being so small and so politically irrelevant that the Mongols didn't bother with him. He was quietly smuggled out, hidden in caravans, protected by distant relatives who hoped, without much confidence, that the dynasty might someday revive. He grew up in Cairo, in a world that was not his, surrounded by reminders of a caliphate that no longer existed. His caretakers told him stories about Baghdad the way people tell children about mythical lands, softly, carefully, with more nostalgia than accuracy. He eventually lived his life as a symbolic figurehead, used by the Mamluks to claim legitimacy. Not a ruler. Not truly a prisoner. Just a polite ornament of empire. A strange existence. Quiet. Dignified. Slightly sad. And finally, a soft glide toward China, where fallen dynasties lingered for centuries. China had one of the most interesting approaches to the children of fallen kings: they let them live. Usually. But under watch. Lots of watch. When the Ming dynasty collapsed and the Qin took over, thousands of princes, princesses, cousins, and faintly related relatives suddenly became remnants of a dynasty that no longer existed. And the Qin, practical as always, had a simple policy. Don't kill them. But don't let them wander either. Many were given small stipends. Small houses. Small expectations. One such child, Zhu Yosong's young nephew, became the quiet center of a small community of surviving Ming loyalists. They treated him with the reverence normally given to a ruler, even though he had no authority and no real future as a monarch. He grew up in a tiny, quiet world, tea houses, old stories, loyal retainers too old to fight, and a city that barely remembered the dynasty he represented. He became a living memory. Not a king. Not a prisoner. just a reminder of something that used to be. And when he died, the loyalists mourned him as if the last ember of an entire era had finally gone out. A very small flame. But a warm one.